Welcome to the Compact Disasters podcast from compactdisasters.com, the show where we explore natural and human-made disasters from around the world. This is episode 54, the leaded petrol health disaster. In the early 20th century, the internal combustion engine faced a persistent problem known as engine knocking. It was caused by the premature ignition of the fuel-air mixture in the cylinder and was variously described as a metallic pinging noise, tapping, or marbles rattling inside a tin can. Knocking often resulted in engine inefficiency and, in some cases, physical damage. Engineers and chemists searched for compounds to suppress knocking known as antidetonants or anti-knock agents. In 1921, chemist Thomas Midgley Jr., working with General Motors, discovered that small amounts of tetraethyl lead, or TEL for short, added to gasoline dramatically reduced engine knock. The compound became widely adopted, marketed as a technological breakthrough. Over the decades, lead became the standard additive in petrol across most of the world to raise octane and protect engines. However, there were health and environmental consequences that were either ignored or suppressed. TEL production was dangerous from the start. Refinery workers handling TEL often suffered from acute lead poisoning and, in some cases, convulsions, mental disturbances, and ultimately, death. Known as loony gas incidents, these early tragedies raised alarm, but industry reassurance and regulatory delays allowed the practice to continue. Meanwhile, as leaded petrol exhaust fumes were released into the air, trace amounts of lead made their way into urban atmospheres, dust, soil, and water. Over decades, the cumulative burden of inhaled or ingested lead grew in the population, even among people far from factories or busy roads. Lead is a potent neurotoxin. In children, exposure affects brain development, lowers IQ, impairs attention and behavior, and increases the risk of lifetime learning and behavioral disorders. In adults, lead contributes to high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, kidney damage, and reduced life expectancy. Because lead accumulates in bones and is released back into the body over time, even if exposure is reduced, past contamination can remain harmful. However, many studies have linked declines in blood lead levels after the removal of leaded gasoline to improvements in public health metrics. Some recent research suggests that decades of exposure to leaded exhaust fumes may have contributed to mental health outcomes, including depression, anxiety, and attentional disorders beyond the classical neurological damage. A controversial but influential theory, often called the lead crime hypothesis, posits that childhood lead exposure contributed to rises in violent crime in many countries during the late 20th century. Some researchers see the removal of lead from gasoline as one factor in subsequent crime declines. By the mid-20th century, leaded petrol was ubiquitous. Millions of tons of lead were added to gasoline worldwide from 1922 onward, peaking in the 1970s and 1980s. Some estimates suggest that the addition of leaded petrol caused an environmental pandemic of lead poisoning. Cities with high vehicle density and heavy traffic bore the most significant burden, with elevated air lead levels, urban dust contamination, and subsequent soil and water pollution. The effect was not just local. Airborne lead is transported by winds and deposited over vast areas, meaning rural regions also suffered. Scientific evidence began to mount by the 1960s and 1970s, exposing correlations between blood lead levels and proximity to traffic, cognitive outcomes, and public health. Regulatory agencies in some countries started to restrict lead content in fuel. In the US, the Clean Air Act of 1970 empowered the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to regulate lead in gasoline. Over time, lead content in petrol was phased out. In 1975, the US banned the sale of leaded gasoline for new automobile engines to protect catalytic converters, and by 1996, leaded petrol for on-road vehicles was entirely outlawed. Internationally, the phase-out took decades. Some countries banned leaded gasoline by the 1990s, while others did so much later. The final country using leaded petrol was Algeria, which ended its production in 2021, marking the official end of leaded gasoline worldwide. The UN Environment Programme has hailed the achievement as the end of an era of one of the most widespread environmental poisons. The removal of lead from gasoline brought dramatic public health benefits. In the US, for example, average blood lead levels dropped by over 90% between 1976 and the 2000s. Globally, many countries saw declines in pediatric lead poisoning, better cognitive outcomes, and reductions in cardiovascular disease. Economically, analysts have estimated enormous gains. The UN has argued that phasing out leaded petrol yields trillions of dollars in benefits annually through improved IQ, increased productivity, lower health costs, fewer crimes, and better longevity. Some studies estimate that lead exposure during the age of leaded petrol reduced global GDP by several percent annually. In the United States, leaded petrol was gradually phased out starting in the 1970s. The EPA's regulation lowered permissible lead concentrations in gasoline in successive steps. As access to unleaded fuel expanded and catalytic converters became standard in cars, leaded petrol became incompatible with newer vehicles. By 1996, the sale of leaded gasoline for on-road vehicles was prohibited nationwide. Following the ban, public health gains were swift. Childhood blood lead levels dropped, and researchers linked the decline to fewer hospitalizations, lower prevalence of lead-related diseases, and improved educational outcomes. Air lead concentrations in the US fell by 98% between 1980 and 2014, largely thanks to the drop in leaded petrol use. The path to banning lead in petrol was contested. Oil companies, additive manufacturers, and some industry-funded scientists disputed health claims, argued for the safety of low lead levels, or demanded more time for transitional technologies. Some critics accused them of suppressing data or downplaying risks. In the early decades, when worker poisonings occurred, the public narrative emphasized safe levels and protective gear rather than systemic rejection. Public health activists, whistleblowers, and independent scientists pushed back. Some scientists suffered professional backlash for health studies implicating leaded gasoline. However, over time, the weight of public evidence prevailed. Even though leaded petrol is gone, its legacy lingers. Lead deposited in urban soils, dust in homes, older infrastructure, and water can still pose health risks, especially in lower-income communities. These legacy lead sources require remediation and public health vigilance. Many cities across the world still struggle with legacy pollution. Areas near highways, industrial zones, and older homes show elevated lead levels in soils and urban dust, meaning that vulnerable populations remain at risk. In recent years, some countries have advocated banning leaded aviation fuel, which is used in small piston-engine aircraft, which is one of the few remaining legal uses of TEL. Although the issue has drawn renewed attention, there is currently no certified, operationally safe alternative that provides the same performance and engine protection. The lead in petrol disaster is not just a relic of the past. It is a cautionary tale about technological hubris, regulatory failure, and environmental injustice. It illustrates how a short-term engineering fix led to a multi-generational public health crisis. It reminds us that pollution, once unleashed, is hard to retract. In global development, Less wealthy countries often banned leaded petrol later than rich nations, meaning children in developing nations bore disproportionate harm, resulting in the lead health burden amplifying inequality in lifetime outcomes. As the climate changes and modern transport technology is introduced, we must remember the lessons. Introducing new technologies should require a complete health risk assessment. The precautionary principle must prevail, and vulnerable populations should be prioritized in prevention and remediation strategies. I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Compact Disasters podcast from compactdisasters.com. If you did, why not leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts? And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. If you would like to support us more directly, please consider buying us a coffee. Head on over to compacthistories.com/disaster coffee to see how. Also, please check out our other Compact podcasts. You will find them all at compacthistories.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.